The concept of moat has been on top of mind for me as a startup founder for the past 5 years. When you start, you go to the internet and you're like, what does competitive advantage mean? And the websites write things and you're like, oh, okay, now I understand. But then in reality, you're like, well, it wasn't any of those things, really. I now realize that I misunderstood what moat meant. Can we go back to the definition?
That's a great question. Moat is an interesting word because the way you describe barriers, the moat immediately is very well defined. You can see the moat. Typically, like moats around castles, there are different types of moats. There are very clear moats. For example, Google's dominance in search, which is the classic, they were the first ones to get into this positive feedback loop. Facebook is another good example where the more success I have, the more successful I become. And because I can now gather all this data around people's search histories, I can make my product better. And there's no way for you to be as good as me because I have access to all this stuff. Those are, I would say, clear moats. They're very difficult to cross. There are other moats where I have economies of scale. And so I can cut costs in a million different places. And there's a million little ways that they can outcompete you that it's hard to articulate one specific thing. OpenAI is like, we have a moat because we have the best model. They just claim it. That may or may not be true. That assumes that their data advantage is a positive feedback loop to their model advantage and is eventually translated to their product advantage. It may be a temporary moat that's going to get filled up in the sense that in the long run, the marginal gains you get from adding additional data is diminishing. And there's a point where everybody have the same models. If you read the business media, there's all these words to describe things. They're just oversimplifications of very nebulous, very messy interactions. It's the same thing with product market fit.
I like how you described it. A lot of the examples that you gave is the future state for most people on this call. People on this call either have startups and or are thinking about it. For a lot of us, that moat doesn't exist. For 4.5 years, I was chasing down one thing that I can point at and be like, hey, investor, hey, customer, this is the thing that you should be very excited about because nobody else has it other than me. Therefore, get excited about it. And this will be so shiny and so clean and so clear that I can just pull it up and say, hey, everybody, come pay me because you want this. But the reality is that that's not the case. That's not how it works. Last year, when I took a step back and tried to rethink what are all the things that I did wrong in my startup, a very interesting idea I came across was business sustainability. And then all of a sudden, the whole moat thing made sense. Moat or competitive advantage at the baseline level is, how's your business going to be sustainable? Then on top of that, if you want to grow, if you want to dominate, then what is very interesting to think about is compounding moats. What niche can you go where whatever it is that you're offering today,
right,
is attractive to a group of people who are like, oh my God, where have you been? That's exactly what I need. It doesn't matter if those are like 2 customers. As long as there is anybody who's paying you for that, that's great. Because you have the beginning of the sustainability. Then what you could do is to start thinking about how can you use that to compound on it, to add to the shiny, clean thing that you want to eventually have one day and build towards it.
Your experience is like battle scars and then reflection, more battle scars. When you're a C-stage investor, you see a lot of pitches, you see a lot of failure cases, particularly for startup founders who are trying to build their first business. You almost don't even think about is like, what are your expectations for the business? Particularly the zero interest rate sort of era is past. People are coming back to saying, what are the potential moats that we can create that are easier to build rather than things that takes a huge amount of money? If you're trying to think of moats, what are you trying to accomplish with moat? How are you going to maintain this moat? Does it need to be a very large moat, or is this like a regional moat? For particularly early stage companies, it's important to make bets about how the market will change and anticipate these moats to begin with. The vast majority of the experiments will not work out. That is okay. This is normal for startups. Just pick yourself back up, reflect on what I thought was going to happen, what actually happened, and Are there any things I can learn from it?
What you need as competitive advantage really depends on the scope and the context of the market your business is operating in. Whatever it is that you're creating customer loyalty with, that's essentially the moat in that scope and context.
You brought up a really good point. One of the things that we automatically imply when we use a language of moat is for the defender who's defending the moat is incredibly cheap. Whereas for an attacker or someone who's trying to bring into the market, they have to spend huge amount of resources to overcome the moat. Now, the moat may be a temporary advantage in the context of your surroundings. I may need to actually spend a huge amount of resources to keep on maintaining the moat, but then that fundamentally changes the value of moat to begin with. If you're a startup founder, it's really important to actually understand the dynamics at play.
The moat or competitive advantage through user experience. That's one of the interesting aspects. And we've seen products that pull that off pretty well, like Slack or Notion. Things that were not new, except that the user experience was different. If we're to use that approach to create moat, what is the thought process?
Whenever you have ahead of the curve technologies, things can go weird. So it's really testing and failing fast on how that may look like. And I'm thinking of big scandals. Those can be prevented ahead of time through testing. For example, AI generated videos based on an original one. It just goes towards that uncanny element at some point. And that's not something I would have anticipated. Tone, frequency, length, like all of these things I didn't anticipate ahead of time. So I think it's really building to even learn what to test, because user experience as a field, it's not that rich yet in relation to these kinds of solutions.
Figure out how to do evaluation centric development, hire a very good experimental minded product person and a very good experimental minded software engineer, and let them loose in the wild to figure it out.
Kevin brought out a good question, which is what if everybody has access to the same technologies? Then you have to start look at other dimensions like how you deliver your designs and the user experience. A good example of this would be adding a chat interface onto language models.
The way I think about interface type of products, a Copilot, it's an existing product that has some sort of a data in it. It has some sort of a user experience. Some user is using it, but you want to bring in an LLM and hopefully with some system design that provides a better user experience versus a platform like Langsmith or Pandas AI. They had an open source library. It got very popular. Now they're turning that into a platform, which is usually a no-code, low-code variation of the same. In both cases, if you're designing the system right, you will usually end up in a scenario where you have a bunch of models that you have trained on your own data or customer data and interfacing these with a bunch of third-party models. What are the opportunities and risks?
That's a really interesting question. There's a lot of different steps, and a single model usually have a very hard time doing all of those things at the same time. And so you do need to chain them together. We have to ask the question, if you're chaining all these things together, how are you going to defend that in the long run? You're sharing all this data around. Can other people just figure out what you're doing and then provide something very similar? You start to see these businesses where they're just wrapper businesses, just use OpenAI everywhere from an architecture perspective. There are other ways of building interface. If, let's say, the architecture leak out to everyone, how can I still maintain that advantage?
Your answer is absolutely right. It's a very big question mark. If you rely so heavily on third party to provide the models, what is it that you own? The answer in my head is that compounding mode. If that's where you start, great, but how are you going to collect the data that allows you to train the same models so you don't have to rely on them, blah, blah, blah. How do you compound to be competitive even if they die? I've been hearing more and more people talking about SaaS as a bad business model for what we are talking about. One thing that we are doing is that we have moved on from SaaS and we are doing a completely solution-based business model. Think about Salesforce, think about IBM. A lot of the interesting things can happen when you're talking about not only a point solution, but rather a solution that involves many steps of a workflow. That's not possible to make it nice and round as a SaaS, but only is possible if you go in and understand really deeply who the pilot is, what systems are involved, etc.
Just think of it as another toolkit you can use. Figure out what your customer are actually willing to pay for. What is the right structure for that makes sense for them? What are they really concerned about? How are you going to make monies with LLM-powered technologies? And how will we continue to do so into the future? We can look at some of the broad categories of different types of businesses that people are trying to build right now. We have like 2 decades of experience starting SaaS businesses. One of the things that I think make SaaS a bit harder in a context of LLM is data sovereignty. I don't want my data passing to your server. I think it changes the dynamics and the incentives of sharing data. The other side is right now it's very compute heavy. And so you start to see more usage-based business models. Certainly the technology itself, but you're thinking about things like, do I have a unique model architecture that's very performative in certain tasks? Can I bring proprietary data into it? Can I integrate all these things together in some unique ways that could be really interesting? You can focus on distribution. This is particularly useful if you already have an existing business that you can push your LLM-based product out to. If you're starting a new business, it's really important to think about what kind of partnership you can form to help with getting your product out there and making sure people actually know about it. There are ways to compete in the basic operational side. Compute is very expensive. If you have access to cheap data centers, or let's say if you have an agreement with a very low energy cost infrastructure provider, that can give you competitive advantage. In addition, there's more qualitative basis where you could change how the market perceives you by market positioning. Maybe you work with a particular customer group and they can vouch for you, and there's a high level of trust when you sell to other customers in that group. Dev tooling is the hottest thing at the moment, partially because right now is so new that it's a do-it-yourself market. Everybody's experimenting with LLM-based systems. Usually in these sort of business models, the customer owns the model and the data. And what they want you to do is just handle some of the details, and particularly the integration details, to manage their experiments. The advantage of running particularly this type of business is it's very high growth during gold rushes, which is, I think, what we're experiencing now. There's a lot of hype. The risk to this is that the music could stop and your business is going to take a hit. There are strategies to mitigate some of these, like putting advanced features behind paywalls. For example, like LangChain, explosive growth as people were experimenting with LLMs. Now they've transitioned into managed product development, essentially going up market, I think. The other side that's very popular now are the co-pilots. These are tools meant to help a pilot. I've met startups who couldn't really articulate who that pilot is. It's really important to know that individual, because how your customer judge the value of a product is based on their experience and performance metrics. One of the things that's really great is there's lots of entry points. So you can take a look at org chart, sort by salary, and just go down the list one by one. One of the things that's interesting about co-pilots is that you can potentially transition into full autopilot products that create experiences where like you don't need human intervention.